Alright guys, so I'm back with another video, and so this is my first video of a master study. It is not a master copy. There's nothing wrong with that. A master study is basically just an artist's attempt using their own knowledge and experience to make an old master's painting. And this one's by Peter Paul Rubens, one of my favorites. And so all I did was take some burnt umber and thinned it out with some odorless mineral spirits, and I made it very, very inky. So I thinned it out quite a bit, and I'm using that as my drawing ink. And I just got a little 1/4-inch flat brush, and I'm just dipping into that. My palette, even though you see my glass palette behind my painting there and to the right, I'm actually not using that. That's from a previous painting, something else that I'm working on. I actually got a small glass palette that you'll see later on in the video just below this painting. It's just off camera. So I'm just taking some of the measurements, and you saw me put the few lines for like with the nose and eyebrow and mouth line and top of the head. Just rough estimates for where I want things to be. And I'm just massing in value. Not thinking color, I'm not thinking anything, I'm just thinking value. And to keep things very, very, very simple, to kind of help it to get like that old master's kind of look, you know, like something that's been laying around for hundreds of years, I used a very limited palette of burnt umber, yellow ochre, and for the highlights I used yellow ochre and just a little bit of white. So I just used basically burnt umber, yellow ochre, and titanium white, but mostly burnt umber and the yellow ochre. And then I just made a basically just two gradations, like a middle kind of tone with that brown and yellow, and then I added more yellow ochre to it and made a much lighter version, which you're seeing me here. So I just made two tones. I kept it very, very simple, just to use this as a bistre, I believe it's called, sort of underpainting, which means just brown. And so on top of this, I'm going to be painting in again with color, with full color, but it's going to be a limited palette. I'm going to be using the Zorn palette, which is ivory black, titanium white, vermilion red, and yellow ochre. And so I just stuck to that for the second pass. So right now this is my first pass, which again is just burnt umber, yellow ochre, and titanium white added to just a little yellow ochre for the highlights, and that's it. That's the only time I use the titanium white. So again, we're just massing in all the shapes. You don't need to think of your drawing in terms of the itsy bitsy stuff. Think big giant masses. Just the big stuff, the big meaty portion of your forehead, the big space between your eyebrow and the bottom of your nose, and from your nose, in this case, from the nose down to the bottom of the beard. Those are just three big spaces, and I compare them to each other. And I say, okay, this one's the same as or similar size as this one, and this one's twice as big or a little bit bigger or whatever compared to this one. And so from the nose down to the beard is obviously the largest piece. And then from the nose to the top of the eyebrow is the smallest, and then from the top of the eyebrow to the receding hairline towards the top there is going to be a little bit bigger than the middle section. And so I made a gray with again this brownish gray. All I did was just add some white to some burnt umber, and it tends to gray it up. You would think because burnt umber is brown, that adding white would give you a lighter, a light brown, and it doesn't really stay brown because most manufacturers, from what I understand, they use ivory black when they make burnt umber or raw umber, some of these other ones. And so when you add white, the black affects it, and so black and white gives you gray. And so that's how I was able to get these brownish grays that you see. And I kept everything very, very simple, very, very loose. I didn't do a whole lot of blending. I've been kind of shifting gears recently, trying to experiment with loosening up, trying to just not be so overly over blending and overly detailed with things as I tend to do. I still like doing that, but in this particular case, I decided to just kind of do just a fun, very limited palette sort of painting. And then once this dries, and this took me about an hour and a half to get to through this first stage of the brown underpainting. About an hour and 20 minutes, something like that. And then after I did this, it was about another hour and a half of doing the second pass, which was using the full color. And again, the colors were the Zorn palette. That's Z as in zebra, O-R-N as in November. Okay, his name was Ambrose Zorn. He was I believe a Swedish painter, and he was famous for using that very limited palette for a lot of his portraits. So he might be somebody you want to look into. He's a fantastic artist. He's dead now, but he's a fantastic artist. He left a very beautiful, large amount of work, so he's easily found on the internet. You can just type in Zorn or Zorn palette. You'll see a million videos talking about him and his style. As far as medium, to thin out my paints, again, just to keep things simple, if you wanted to try this on your own, I just use odorless mineral spirit solvent. And so I just use that, especially in the background. I used it more heavily just because to thin out the paint so it'll spread easier. Because what ends up happening is if you take paint right out of the tube, it's very, very thick. And so it's hard to manage. So I find that it's a lot better to thin it out with some mineral spirits, especially when it's the first layer. I used only a little bit of mineral spirits, very, very little, just the very tip of my brush when I was doing the flesh and the beard. And the reason I used it again was just to thin out my paints a little bit, but I didn't want to overly thin it out, because if not, it won't cover the canvas. And I used this as just so you know, as an 11 by 14 stretch canvas, nothing fancy, kind of stuff you can get at Michael's. And it was a lot of fun to do this. Keep in mind that whenever you're working with an underpainting, you're usually doing what's called a monochromatic painting, meaning one color. So basically, in this case, I'm using technically three colors, but the dominant one being, of course, the brown burnt umber color. And I just lightened it with the yellow ochre and made some grays with a little yellow ochre, titanium white, and the burnt umber. So the burnt umber is basically the predominant paint color here, lightened up with the other two. Mainly just the yellow ochre, very little of the titanium white. The shirt that he's wearing are robes, I guess they're monk robes. I just used a brown the burnt umber brown color that I mixed up with a little bit of the titanium white, kind of lighten it up and grade up, and then some of the yellow ochre just to kind of make it a hair bit yellower, which helps to get close to what I see in the photograph. And again, keep in mind, this is a master study. I'm not trying to copy every square millimeter of color that I see in the photo. And you shouldn't either. You should paint with knowledge and experience, and I guess you could say with a set of rules. And that's really what I find to be a much more effective way of working. A lot of times people will ask me, what color is that? That sort of thing. And they're trying so hard to match some photocopy that they printed from their printer. Problem is, every printer is going to be different. The camera that was used, this by the way, I got this from, I believe it was Google Art and Culture, something like that. It's like a museum online. You can zoom in and get really crystal clear pictures. So I believe that's where I got this from. If you took a photograph with your phone, that photograph is going to be affected by the lighting, the temperature of the light. Are you indoors with artificial lighting? Are you outside and it's cloudy or extremely sunny or something in between? There's going to be a lot of factors that you just can't control as an artist. And so instead of trying to copy every square millimeter of a photograph, which some people do it, you can do that if it makes you happy, but you become more like a machine, and it really becomes a real dreadful, that would not be something I'd be looking forward to do. That would be the opposite of fun. So I couldn't imagine getting in there with a picture in hand, trying to copy exactly what that is. Because if you take a picture of your Uncle Bob and he's inside your living room, you look at that picture, then you look at a picture you took of him outside when you were having a barbecue. His skin tone can look very, very different. Might be a lot warmer because he's outside, and he might have a lot cooler, bluer, grayer sort of shadows outdoors, whereas sitting on your couch in your living room watching TV, he looks very, very different. He looks maybe a little cooler. Maybe he looks a little warmer. I don't know how you light your house, the angle you took the picture from. I mean, there's so many things that are going to affect it that it's better to just simplify. Simplify is the magic word in art, especially if you decided to get into some sort of color, whether it be color pencil or watercolor, acrylic, oil, whatever. Once you get into color, you start getting into that realm of nightmares, because people get really, really caught up on what color is that, and they try to match exactly these photographs, and then they fail, and then they give up, and I don't want that for you. So the rules that I used, I'll just tell you what palette I used here. As you seeing here, I already started the color portion of it. This had dried overnight. Being burnt umber, it dries very, very fast. What you see here again is the Zorn palette, titanium white, ivory black, yellow ochre, and vermilion red. And I stuck to just those 4 colors for this second pass. Okay, nothing else was added. I didn't use the burnt umber from the first pass. I didn't use black. I didn't use blue or anything else. Just those 4. And so I took some of the vermilion red and some of the yellow ochre, and I mixed it. And towards the end of this video, you'll see a little clip of my palette, just so you can see the colors and how simple and very limited palette. And I just mixed up this orangey color with the red and the yellow. Okay, again, vermilion red and yellow ochre. I just made this reddish orange. Okay, so to that, because it's too bright, that's gonna, I'm gonna add some white just to tone it down a little bit. And then I added just a little tiny tip of my black. I just touched the tip of my brush, something about the size of a half of a teardrop, okay, a pepper flake. And when I dip my brush into that black, I go into that mixture, that orangey red mixture, and I move it around. What that black does, it cools down and neutralizes the brightness of the color. Because if I were to use that color, it would just be too bright. It would be too what's called saturated. Okay, so you would need something. In this case, I'm using the black. In other palettes, somebody might use a green or a blue or a brown, like the burnt umber or raw umber. Okay, and the reason they do that, again, is to neutralize that really bright color that you're struggling with. You're looking at it, wow, that is really bright. You know, your uncle looks like a carrot, right? Or he looks just really, really red, or whatever the issue is. You tone it down and just look. You keep it looking real by adding, in this case, again, with this palette, with this 4-color palette, just a little tiny touch of that black, and instantly you see the skin tones just calm down a bit. Then I took some of that and I put it off to the side, and I added more white to it, and that white basically makes another lighter version of the first color. Then for the highlights, I basically took the yellow ochre and the white, and I mixed them in, more white than the yellow ochre, so I can get this nice yellowy sort of white. So you never want to use straight white as a highlight, because it's not natural. If you look at the highlights on your skin and you hold up a piece of white paper next to that highlight, you'll notice the white paper is much brighter than the highlight on your face or your arm or your leg. Those highlights on your body are going to be closer to a yellowy sort of color, to maybe something like a gray, sort of light gray sort of tone, to a pinky tone. Okay, anything but white. You never want to use white. If you find yourself in a situation where you need to use white to show that highlight because it's just not popping enough, that means the surrounding tones of the skin are just, they're too light in color. You made them so light that only white will pop, and therefore you need to scrape the paint off and start all over again, or just add, mix another darker version and go over what you did. Okay, so that's probably one of the most helpful tips that I can give you if you're getting into portrait or figure. If you find yourself needing white for the highlights because nothing else is working, then the surrounding skin tones are just too bright. You made them way too bright. So that's a very, very important rule, I guess you could call it. That's one of the principles that I follow when I'm painting. So always try to err on the side of making your skin tone a little duller and a little darker than what you imagine. A lot of times when people are starting out in this, the colors are just so saturated. They're so bright that it becomes unreal. And so the addition of a cool color, in this case black, just tones it down. So again, as far as color, vermilion red, yellow ochre, titanium white, and ivory black. If I can suggest anything to you as far as a palette to practice with, it would be that. I believe that is such a great palette. It would give you such variety that if you need gray, you got black and white, mix them together, and there you go. You can even warm that gray up with just a little tiny touch of the yellow or the red, and it'll kind of just, warm it up a little bit, yellow it up a little bit, make it whatever it is you want. The highlights, sometimes depending on the situation, like on a lip or the tip of the nose, I'll use some of the vermilion red and the titanium white, make a pinky white sort of highlight, and that way it represents that warmer section of your face. Where you're going to see a lot of the reds and the pinks and stuff like that is going to be in the center portion, the center third of your face. That's from the eyebrows to the nose. That's going to be all warm areas there. From the eyebrows to the hairline, tends to be more yellow. And from the nose down to your chin, or in this case his beard, it tends to be more grayed out. And so it becomes blue. So a good way of remembering that, from top to bottom are the three primaries: yellow, red, and blue. And by blue, I mean just cooled down, not necessarily the color blue, just cooled down. In this case, we used black. All right, so here's a clip showing you my palette. There's the red mixed with the yellow ochre. On the left, there's some gray. And then towards the center left is the mixtures. And there's the finished product. I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to subscribe and to hit like. Have a great day.